I played tennis in college. Not extremely well, but I played. No matter how good an opponent was, I always managed to win some of the points. And no matter how bad an opponent was, they always managed to win a few points as well. In most sports, there are obvious ups and downs that occur throughout a competition. Basketball players, for example, rarely make or miss all of their shots. One persistent myth that we have in sports psychology research is that an athlete's mindset remains more or less the same throughout a particular competition. A lot of the research that we have is questionnaire research where an athlete is given a questionnaire on some measures such as self-efficacy or anxiety prior to a competition, and their performance throughout the entire competition is correlated with their score on that questionnaire. Now, this is problematic because just as there are ups and downs, missed shots and made shots throughout a competition, an athlete's mindset tends to vary with those perceived successes and perceived failures. So what we're going to talk about today is the process of competition and the ways that athletes tend to respond to success and tend to respond to failure. In working with athletes as a sports psychology consultant, I learned that athletes tend to respond to perceived failure and perceived success in relatively predictable ways. And it's easiest to describe this in terms of worst ever and best ever performances. The experience of perceived failure that results in an athlete eventually wanting to quit first involves frustration, then preoccupation, and finally an athlete dialing out. On the flip side, perceived success is associated with a progression toward top performance and can be understood in a similar sequence, from pleased to energized to an athlete dialing in. The sequential relationship among these 6 competitive positions are best understood when situated around a semi-circumflex called the performance dial. The inverted triangle at the top of the dial indicates a theoretically neutral starting position between the negative and the positive sides. I'll describe the competitive positions on the negative side first. Frustrated. The frustrated competitive position is a mildly negative phenomenological state in which an athlete is disappointed by performance outcomes. Frustration is the most immediate result of perceived failure. Let's use the example of a distance runner named Beth. Beth became frustrated when the group of 4 or 5 girls ran out ahead of her at the beginning of the race and began to distance themselves from the rest of the group. Failure may be quite obvious, such as a double fault in tennis, or more subtle, such as a serve hit poorly, allowing the opponent to aggressively return the ball. Frustration can be the result and cause of poor performance. One possible reason why frustration can negatively influence performance is that failure may increase the velocity and negativity of the athlete's self-talk. Van Ralt and her colleagues found that youth and adult tennis players engage in more self-talk after points lost that is negative than after points won. Van Ralt and colleagues also found that 96% of negative self-talk followed points lost. The finding that points lost are associated with an increase in the rate of self-talk is not surprising, considering that athletes are more likely to try to make sense of failure than to make sense of success. Attempts to make sense of failure might lead the athlete to focus internally on skill execution and attempt to consciously control body movements. Compared with automatic processing, controlled processing leads to decreases in performance among skilled athletes. Because of the decreased efficiency associated with controlled processing, as well as the investment of limited attentional resources to understand past performance, an athlete's probability of successful performance decreases as she approaches preoccupation. Preoccupied. When an athlete is already frustrated, additional failure might lead to preoccupation. Preoccupation is a moderately negative competitive position in which the athlete is obsessed with prior performance outcomes. In a qualitative study of athletes' experiences during catastrophic performances, Edwards and colleagues found that anxiety and increased performance evaluation were associated with performance decline. Beth described preoccupation with her poor performance by indicating that she got more and more upset as girls passed her and that she just kept thinking about how bad she was doing. In some sense, preoccupation can be described as analysis to paralysis, because when an athlete is preoccupied, a cognitive overload occurs such that the athlete is less able to plan for future performance. Preoccupation is especially likely if the athlete interprets prior performances emotionally rather than informationally, because the athlete is likely to be focused on task-irrelevant thoughts. As stated by Lazarus, when our goals and thoughts, perhaps manifested in ruminations, are irrelevant to the task, they will interfere with cognitive and motor activities that are essential for top performance. When preoccupied with prior performance, many athletes worry and describe attempts to break down actions into elementary parts, analyze them, and develop strategies that will result in more favorable performance outcomes. Conscious control of behavior, which is common in pressure situations, inhibits automatic responses and disrupts well-learned behaviors. Consistent with these findings, Edwards and his colleagues found that inappropriate effort aimed at reversing prior outcomes is associated with performance decline. Athletes also indicate a loss of confidence in their ability to successfully accomplish desired behaviors, which is consistent with the finding of Edwards and his colleagues that many athletes report a lack of control over the performance during catastrophic performances. The intensity of the negative experience and the likelihood of poor performance increases as the athlete continues to perceive failure. Dialed out. When an athlete is preoccupied with his or her performance, additional failure may bring the athlete to a critical point at which he or she is motivated to quit or dial out. The dialed out competitive position is an intensely negative phenomenological state in which the athlete no longer strives to reverse undesirable performance outcomes. The idea that sustained failure can cause an athlete to essentially give up is supported by the findings of Edwards and his colleagues that performance evaluation is common during catastrophic performances, but not during post-catastrophic stages. Ceasing to evaluate disappointing performances may be one way that athletes cope with adverse situations. Beth indicated that she did not make a conscious choice to quit the race, but that she just didn't care anymore. The dialed out athlete either withdraws from the performance literally, as in an athlete who leaves the field or asks the coach to remove him or her, strategically, as in an athlete who tanks or purposely performs poorly to expedite a seemingly inevitable outcome, or emotionally, like an athlete such as Beth who gives up his or her desire to perform. In any case, dialing out is associated with a desire to discontinue participation in a competition. Now let's look at the process that takes place throughout athletes' best performances. We return to the neutral starting position indicated by the inverted triangle above the performance dial, in which the athlete has not yet been affected by failure. From this point, perceived success promotes a mildly positive phenomenological state in which an athlete is pleased with previous performance outcomes. Beth indicated that she was pleased by her performance at the start of her best race because she started toward the front and began passing her competitors. Success promotes positive self-talk, positive feelings, and the belief that the athlete can achieve desirable outcomes. Perception of success also increases intrinsic motivation in athletes, even when the perception is based on false feedback information. Increases in intrinsic motivation associated with success lead to increased concentration on the performance task. For these reasons, the probability of successful performance tends to increase as an athlete approaches the energized competitive position. Energized When an athlete is already pleased with his or her performance, additional perceived success may result in an energized competitive position. The energized competitive position is a moderately positive phenomenological state in which the athlete is thrilled by performance outcomes. Beth illustrated her experience in the energized competitive position by indicating that each time she passed another runner, it was like she got a little burst of energy. As an athlete continues to experience success, intrinsic motivation increases. Whereas frustration and preoccupation involves a desire to change behaviors and outcomes, an energized state involves a desire to continue a course of action. As the athlete approaches top performance, he or she is able to focus externally and process relevant information from his or her environment. The external focus of attention promotes automatic control of body movement, which requires minimal attentional resources and increases the likelihood of successful performance. Upon achieving additional success in an energized state, an athlete might dial in and reach top performance. Dialed in. The dialed-in competitive position can be illustrated metaphorically as verisimilitude. Verisimilitude is a big word that means sameness, describing the experience of a reader who forgets that she is reading words printed on paper because she is, in a sense, in the story. Reading involves a physical process, visually scanning words printed in ink on paper, and a mental process, forming mental representations occasioned by those words. Physical and mental processes do not always work together. A reader may pass her eyes over the text of a novel while entertaining mental representations related to a concert she attended earlier that evening. The reader suspends her disbelief and experiences verisimilitude when her focus is captured by the narrative and she is no longer attends to irrelevant thoughts, including metacognitions related to the fact that she is aware she is reading. In verisimilitude, the physical process is automated, which allows the reader to attend to the story because she does not have to consciously control the physical process of reading. Athletes report similar experiences. While athletes may sometimes dwell on the consequences of past performance outcomes or possible future outcomes while engaging in motor behaviors in the present, the dialed-in athlete is able to more fully attend to the story of the performance because his or her motor behavior has become, at least temporarily, automated. Automated motor behavior allows the athlete to focus more exclusively on achieving desired outcomes. Beth indicated that each time she picked off another runner, all she wanted to do was get to the next one. The probability of successful performance is highest in the dialed-in competitive position. Now let's think about how an athlete's competitive position at any particular time might move around their performance style throughout a competition. To introduce the performance style as succinctly as possible, thus far the experiences of athletes have been described only in terms of continuous perceived success or continuous perceived failure. Obviously, most performances include both success and failure because, for example, tennis players typically do not win all or lose all of their points in a tennis match. In many sports, athletes are likely to move back and forth between competitive positions multiple times during a single competition. It is unlikely that an athlete would spend equal amounts of time in each competitive position because athletes indicate that most performance occurs toward a theoretically neutral starting point in the frustrated or pleased competitive positions. The way the phenomenological state of an athlete changes throughout a competition can be described in relation to the magnitude and source of movements. Change might be gradual or drastic, depending on the situation. For example, a missed penalty kick during an important match may cause greater movement than a poor pass during a less important match. Drastic changes in perceived success or perceived failure may result in a shift between competitive positions, while more gradual changes may be thought of as vibrations within a competitive position. Beth described a shift into the dialed-out competitive position by indicating that she just kept thinking about how bad she was doing until finally, she said, "This is not my day." Movement between competitive positions is either passive or active. Passive movement occurs when the athlete is either unaware or unable to control the influence of her evaluations. Thus far, the athlete has been described as a passive agent who is acted upon by perceived success or perceived failure, that she is shifting between competitive positions passively. Active movements occur when the athlete consciously ignores the influence of perceived failure, or when the athlete is able to process performance feedback informationally rather than emotionally. The idea that athletes can willfully move between competitive positions is consistent with Bob Rutella's contention that athletes possess the free will to influence their own thinking. The ability to influence their own thinking is one way of understanding what it means to be mentally tough. Now let's think about how we might be able to apply the performance dial to the performance of our athletes. And one application of the performance dial can be summarized by the following 4 steps. First, the coach asks the athlete to describe the experience of his or her worst performances from beginning to end and in as much detail as possible. Second, the athlete is asked to describe the experiences of his or her best performances from beginning to end. The process of verbalizing best and worst performances is important for many athletes in developing self-awareness and identifying barriers to better performance. And this is something that the coach can help the athlete with. Third, the practitioner helps the athlete identify common elements within his or her best and worst performances. After athletes initially describe the experience of their best and worst performances, it may be useful to repeat the athlete's words back to them with reference to the performance style, to help Beth understand how her reactions to prior performance influenced her subsequent performance. I wrote Beth's descriptions in each competitive position on the performance dial. For example, I wrote the phrases 5 girls ran out ahead and girls started passing me in the frustrated competitive position, then wrote the phrases every time someone would pass me I would get more and more upset and I just kept thinking about how bad I was doing in the preoccupied competitive position. And I wrote the phrases "this is not my day" and "I just want it to end" in the dialed out competitive position. This exercise helped Beth, and it could help some athletes become more aware of patterns in their performance experiences and better understand how responses to previous performance outcomes can influence subsequent performance. The psychologist Lazarus indicated that it would help if athletes understood which emotions are aroused in competition, their individual vulnerability to them, and how best to cope. Athletes who are able to understand their sport performance experiences, as illustrated by this performance style, are more likely to understand why relaxation, imagery, self-talk, and other psychological skills interventions could help them perform more successfully. And as a result, they may be more motivated to buy in and adhere to psychological skills training programs. For example, understanding her experiences in relation to the performance style helped convince Beth that her experiences were not unusual or stupid, as she had said. Finally, when necessary, the coach might use the experiences described by the athlete to determine appropriate interventions, providing a rationale for each intervention with reference to the performance style. For example, a coach working with Beth might suggest using relaxation training to help her deal with frustration, or suggest using guided imagery to help her imagine being dialed in during future races to increase the likelihood that she actually will dial in during future races. Remember that during an athletic performance, an athlete's mindset, their concentration, motivation, and confidence will vary greatly, and often this occurs in response to success and failure. And you want to be intentional about knowing your players so that you can see by their body language and by their facial expressions where they're at